I have buried the richest man in this county and the poorest, and laid them both down in the same good earth with the same gentle hands. I have buried a woman who left a fortune to a college, and a man who left nothing but a fishing pole and a Bible with his children's names written in the front. I have buried church mothers and gamblers, deacons and drunks, a mayor and the man who swept the floor of the building the mayor worked in. I have sat with families who arrived in 3 black cars and families who arrived on foot, and I gave every single one of them the same thing, the only thing that has ever mattered in my profession, which is to send their loved one home with dignity. That is the work. That has always been the work. And one autumn, a very powerful woman walked into my funeral home and tried, with all the money and all the status she had, to make me bury one good man as something less than the man he truly was. And I want to tell you how I would not let her. My name is Augusta Lockhart. I am 54 years old, and I am the owner and the director of Lockhart & Sons Funeral Home here in Richmond, Virginia, which my great-grandfather opened with his own 2 hands more than 100 years ago. It says "and sons" on the sign, but I am a daughter, and the sons did not want this work, and I did, so I am the Lockhart who carries it now. I have spent 30 years as the woman this community trusts to take care of their dead, and I will tell you, there is no more sacred trust on this earth, and I have never once betrayed it. Not for money, not for fear, and not for the most powerful family in this city. Before I go on, let me speak to somebody listening to me tonight. If you have ever done the quiet, faithful, unglamorous work, the work that does not get applause, the real work, while other people chased the shine and the status and the show, and then had one of those shine chasers look down their nose at you, tell me about it in the comments. Tell me about the time somebody who had everything looked at the honest work of your hands like it was beneath them. Because I have a feeling this room is about to fill up with people who know the difference between status and substance. And I want every one of you sitting with me tonight. Now let me tell you why a funeral home like mine exists at all. Because you cannot understand this story until you understand that there was a time in this country, and it was not so very long ago, when a black family could not bury their dead with dignity. The white undertakers would not take our people, or if they did it carelessly, roughly, in the back, as an afterthought, the way you would dispose of something rather than honor someone. They would bury our loved ones in the bad part of the cemetery, in the wet ground, sometimes in the wrong box, sometimes with no care at all for the body that a family had loved. And there is an old, hard truth that the elders used to say, that for black folks in those days, the way you were treated while you were living followed you right into how you were treated when you died. The disrespect did not stop at the grave. So our people built their own. My great-grandfather was one of them. He learned the trade, and he opened a place where a black family could bring their mother, their father, their child, and know for certain that the hands taking care of them understood that this person had mattered, that this person was somebody. The Black Funeral Home became one of the few places in the whole world where our dignity was not up for debate, where we got to grieve in our own way, sing our own songs, dress our dead in their finest, and send them home like the kings and queens we always knew they were, no matter what the world outside those doors had said about them. The funeral director, in those days, was one of the most respected people in the whole community, right alongside the preacher and the doctor, because the funeral director was the one who guaranteed that the last thing that ever happened to you on this earth would be done with love. I come from that. I carry that. It is in my hands every single day. Let me tell you what the work actually is, because people flinch when I say what I do, and they should not. When a family hands me their loved one, they are handing me a person at the single most defenseless moment of that person's whole existence. They cannot speak for themselves anymore. They cannot fix their own hair or straighten their own collar or ask to be seen a certain way. Every choice about how they meet the world one last time falls to me, and I treat that as the holy thing it is. I have sat up all night with a body, the way you would sit up with a sick child, getting a man's mustache exactly the way his widow described it to me, finding the right shade to bring a grandmother's face back to the way her grandchildren would remember her, so that when that family walks in and looks down into that casket, they do not see a stranger. They see their person at peace. That is craftsmanship, and it is love, and it is a kind of love you pour out on someone who can never, ever thank you for it. There is no purer work on this earth than that. My great-grandfather taught his son, who taught my father, who taught me, that you do for the dead what you would do for your own, every time, with no exceptions, because the day you start deciding that some bodies deserve more care than others is the day you have lost the right to touch any of them. There is a book in my front office, a great big leather register, and it goes back to my great-grandfather's very first year. Every soul this family has ever laid to rest is written in that book, by hand, in ink. And here is the thing about that book that I want you to hold on to. The richest banker in Richmond and the woman who cleaned his office are written in the same book, in the same careful hand, with the same care, one name after another. And if you opened it, you could not tell from the writing which one had money and which one did not. Because in my book and in my house, there is no difference. Death is the great leveler, and dignity is not a thing you earn with a bank account. Dignity is a thing every human being is owed simply for having lived. My great-grandfather believed that. I believe it. And it is the whole reason I do this work the way I do it. I write every name in that book myself. I have never once let a secretary or an assistant do it, not in 30 years, because the writing of the name is part of the honoring. When I dip the pen and I write a person's full name, slowly, in my best hand, I am saying, in the only permanent way I know how, you were here, you were real, you mattered, and as long as this book exists, nobody can erase the fact that you walked this earth. I have written the names of babies who lived a single day. I have written the names of men who died alone with no family to claim them, men the county would have rolled into an unmarked hole, and I took them in. And I gave them a service even if I was the only soul standing there. And I wrote their names in my book in the very same ink as everybody else. Because a man with no one to mourn him needs the dignity more than anyone, not less. That book is my testimony. It says that under this roof, for more than 100 years, not one single human being was ever treated as though they did not count. I have learned something, standing where I stand, that most people never get to learn. You find out exactly who a person really was by their funeral, not by the size of it, by the truth of it, by who comes and what they cry about and the stories they tell in the parking lot afterward. I have buried important men whose grand funerals were packed with people who did not shed one real tear, who were only there to be seen. And I have buried so-called nobodies whose little services were so full of genuine grief that the walls could barely hold it. The funeral does not lie. The casket is the same size for everybody, and what fills the room around it is the only true measure of a life there has ever been. I read funerals the way some people read books. I buried a man once, a deacon, who had everybody fooled. Big funeral. The church was packed wall to wall, and I stood in the back the way I always do, and I watched. And I will tell you, that room was dry as a bone. People dressed up, people respectful, but not one soul truly broke. They grieved the idea of him, the position of him, but nobody grieved the man, because the man, it turned out, had been hard and cold to the very people closest to him, and you cannot fake the kind of weeping that only real love produces. And not a month later, I buried a woman who had cleaned houses her whole life, in a service so small we barely needed the side room. And that little room came apart at the seams, grown men down on their knees, because she had loved everybody she ever met. And love like that leaves a mark that shows up plain as day at the end. I never say a word about what I see. It is not my place. But I see it. The funeral is the 1 hour in which a person's whole life finally tells the truth about itself, out loud, in front of everybody, whether the family wants it told or not. And that is how I knew, long before his daughter did, exactly what kind of man Mr. Solomon Gaines had been. Mr. Solomon Gaines was a big man in this city. He had built a successful business from nothing, back when nothing was all a black man was allowed to start with, and he had made real money, and he had earned real respect. By the end of his life, he was the kind of man whose name was on a plaque at the hospital and a scholarship at the school. To the wide world, he was a success story, a pillar, a distinguished gentleman in a good suit. And all of that was true, but it was not the truest thing about him. And the truest thing was a thing he kept quiet, the way the deepest men always keep the best of themselves quiet. You have to understand the kind of respect Solomon Gaines commanded in the daylight world. When he walked into a room, important men stood up. He had built something that had employed half the neighborhood at one time or another. He had sat on boards and shaken hands with governors. He could have had any funeral home in the state begging for the honor, could have had a service in the biggest sanctuary in Richmond with every dignitary in attendance and the newspaper waiting out front. By every measure the world uses to keep score, Solomon Gaines had won, and won big. Which is exactly why what he chose to do with all of it tells you everything you need to know. A man who has every reason to be proud, and who spends his pride instead on making absolutely certain that nobody poorer than him ever feels small in his presence. That is a rare and a holy thing. He used his success as a roof to shelter other people under, and never once as a wall to keep them out. I knew the truest thing, because I am from the same streets Solomon Gaines was from, the same humble blocks he never once in his whole life pretended he had not come from. And on those blocks, everybody knew. We knew that when old Miss Hattie was about to lose her house, a payment appeared from nowhere and saved it. And we knew where it came from. We knew that when a boy from the projects got into college but could not afford the bus there, somebody quietly bought the ticket and a winter coat besides. We knew that the back rent got paid, that the funeral got covered, that the light bill got handled. Over and over, for 40 years, for people who never knew the name of the man who had blessed them, because he made sure they never found out. Solomon Gaines gave away a quiet fortune to the people the world had forgotten, and he did it without his name on a single bit of it. The plaques were for the things that did not cost him much. The real giving he hid, because he understood something about dignity too. He understood that the way you give a person help can either lift them up or shame them. And he chose, every time, to lift them up by keeping himself invisible. I will tell you how I came to know it for certain, and why it sits so deep in me. My own mother fell behind one terrible winter when I was a girl, after my father got hurt and could not work for a season. And one evening there came a knock, and when we opened the door, there was no one there, only an envelope on the step with just enough inside it to carry us through to spring, and not one word of who had sent it. My mother sat down at the kitchen table and cried over that envelope. We never knew. And it was not until I was grown and running this funeral home, and Solomon Gaines was sitting across from me arranging his own burial, that he let one small thing slip, a detail about that particular winter that no living person could have known unless he was the one who had climbed our steps in the cold and set that envelope down and walked away into the dark. I looked at him. He looked at me. And he just gave me the smallest shake of his head, the way you do when you are asking someone, "Please, keep my secret. He had been carrying this whole city on his back for 40 years and making sure not one of us could ever say thank you, because a thank you would have made it about him. And he never once in his life let it be about him. That is the man his daughter walked into my office wanting me to fold up into a plaque. And here is what he did that brought his daughter into my funeral home. Furious. Years before he passed, Solomon Gaines came to see me. He sat down in my office, across from that big register book, and he told me that when his time came, he wanted me to bury him. Not the big fancy firm downtown that his money could have bought 10 times over. Me, Lockhart & Sons, on the humble side of town. He wanted to be brought home, he said, to the kind of place that would understand him. And he gave me a letter, sealed, and he said, "Augusta, when I am gone, my family is going to want to make a production. They are going to want to turn me into somebody I was not. You are going to hold this letter, and you are going to make sure I am buried as the man I actually was." And I gave him my word, and in my profession, my word is the only thing I have that is worth more than that 100-year-old book. So when Mr. Gaines passed, I knew exactly what he wanted, because I was holding it in his own handwriting in my safe. And then his daughter arrived. Her name was Constance, and she had spent her whole adult life climbing away from the very streets her father refused to leave. She had married into an old moneyed family. She went by her married name in the society pages, and she had built herself a life so polished and so high up that the humble place she came from had become to her an embarrassment to be managed. She walked into my funeral home in a suit that cost more than I make in a month, looked around at my modest, spotless, lovingly kept front room, and I watched her face do the thing I have seen 1,000 times, the flicker of distaste, the quick math of a person deciding that where she is standing is beneath her. I knew Constance a little, from a long way back, though she would never in 100 years have admitted it. We were girls in the same part of town once, before her father's money lifted the family up and out. But somewhere along the way, she had decided that the climbing was the whole point of a life, and that the people still standing at the bottom of the ladder she had climbed were proof of something shameful, rather than people she had simply been luckier than. She had remade herself completely, her voice, her clothes, the very way she held her shoulders. And the one thing she could not forgive her father for was that he had refused, all his life, to climb away with her. He kept his old friends. He kept his old church. He kept eating at the same little places and sitting on the same front porches. And to Constance, every single time he did it, he was dragging the family's good name back down into the place she had worked so hard to escape. She did not hate her father. I want to be fair to her. She was ashamed of him, which is a different and a sadder thing. And she had not the faintest idea that the man she was ashamed of was the finest human being for 100 miles in any direction. "I'm sure you understand," she said to me, before she had even sat down, "that a man of my father's stature requires a certain kind of service. I've already spoken to Beaumont's downtown. They handle people at our level. I'll need you to simply release his body to them. I'm sure my father had some sentimental reason for the arrangement he made with you, but I'm his daughter, and I'll be making the real decisions." I let her finish. I am good at letting people finish. And then I told her, gently, that her father had left written, witnessed, legally sound instructions, and that those instructions named this funeral home and named me, and that I intended to honor them. And I watched Constance Gaines realize that the humble woman in the modest building was not going to simply hand her what she wanted. She got cold then. She told me she would pay me handsomely to step aside. When that did not work, she told me she had powerful friends and powerful lawyers, and that I would regret making an enemy of her family. And then she got to the heart of it, the thing she actually wanted, which was not really about which building. She leaned forward and she said, Whatever we do, there are going to be certain people who will want to come, people from his old neighborhood. I would prefer the service be kept dignified, exclusive. I don't want this turning into some kind of, I want it to reflect who my father became, not where he started. And there it was. She wanted me to help her bury the truth of her own father. She wanted a closed, fancy, ticket-only service for important people, and she wanted to keep out the very people who had loved Solomon Gaines the most, the people he had spent his whole secret life lifting up. Because to Constance, those people were an embarrassment, a stain on the polished image she had built. She wanted to put her father in the ground as a stranger, dressed up as the man she wished he had been, with all the best of him locked outside the door. And I am going to be honest with you about the next part, because the easy thing, the smart thing for my business, would have been to give her what she wanted. Constance Gaines could hurt me. That was not an idle threat. Her family had the money and the lawyers to tie my little funeral home up in court for years. To whisper to the right people that Lockhart & Sons was difficult, unprofessional, not to be trusted with your family. One powerful, angry woman can do a great deal of quiet damage to a small business that runs on a community's trust. And there was a voice in me, the tired, practical voice, that said, "Augusta, you are 54 years old. You have a business to protect. Just release the body. Take the loss. Let the rich people have their show. It is not your fight. Hand her the body and keep the peace." And that voice was not a foolish one. I have a husband, Calvin, who works alongside me in this, and a building with a mortgage on it, and good people on my staff with families of their own. And all of it rests on this community believing that Lockhart & Sons can be trusted. I knew the cost of crossing Constance Gaines, down to the dollar, and I am not going to pretend to you that the cost was not real. I went and stood in front of that register book. I opened it the way I do when I need to remember who I am, and I ran my finger down the names, the banker and the cleaning woman in the same ink. And I thought about my great-grandfather, who opened these doors precisely so that no black soul would ever again be buried as less than they were, by anybody. And then I went to my safe, and I took out Solomon Gaines's letter, and I held it, this dead man's trust, sitting in my hand, the trust of a man who had spent 40 years quietly making sure other people kept their dignity, asking me now to make sure he kept his. And I understood that releasing his body to Constance would not be keeping the peace. It would be doing to Solomon Gaines, in death, the exact thing the world used to do to our people. It would be letting the disrespect follow him into the grave. And I could not, I would not be the one to do that to him. Not for her money, not for her lawyers, not for anything. So I did not raise my voice, because I never do. I told Constance Gaines that I was sorry for her loss, that I meant that with my whole heart, and that her father would be staying with us, because that was his lawful and witnessed wish, and that the service would be open, because that too was his wish, written in his own hand, which I would gladly show to her or to any judge she cared to call. And I told her one more thing. I told her that she was welcome to plan whatever grand memorial she liked, anywhere she liked, for whatever people she liked. But the funeral, the homegoing, the laying down of Solomon Gaines would be done my way, because it would be done his way. And there was nothing on this earth she could offer me or threaten me with that would make me break my word to a dead man who had trusted me. She left in a fury. I expected her lawyers. They never came, and I think I know why, but I will get to that. We held the service on a Saturday morning, and the doors were open, just like he wanted. And I want you to understand what walked through those open doors. They came on foot, and they came on the bus. Miss Hattie came, 90 years old now, the one whose house got saved, leaning on her grandson. The boy who got the bus ticket and the winter coat came. Except he is not a boy anymore. He is a physician now, a surgeon. And he came in and he stood at that casket and he wept like a child. They came all morning, dozens and dozens of them, then over 100. The ones the world forgot, the ones Solomon Gaines had quietly carried. And one by one, they came to the microphone and they told their stories. And most of them were telling their story for the very first time, because most of them had never known until that morning that it had been the same man. They had each thought they were the only one. And as story after story filled that room, you could feel the whole congregation realizing together the size of the secret life of this quiet man. The sheer scope of all the lifting he had done with his left hand, so his right hand would not know. An old man named Tobias stood up, and his hands were shaking. And he said that more than 30 years ago, he had been at the very end of his rope, that he had lost his job and his wife and his way all in one season, and that Solomon Gaines, who barely knew him, had shown up at his door not with money first, but with himself, and had sat with him on the floor of that little apartment most of the night, just so he would not be alone in the dark, and had come back every evening for a month until the worst of it had passed. He said, "That man gave me 30 more years of my life, and my children, and these grandchildren sitting right here beside me, and I never once got to tell him, because he made me promise never to speak of it while he was living. And now he is gone," Tobias said, "and now, at last, I can." And there were a dozen more like him, then 24, a flood of them, secret after secret after secret, pouring out into that open room. And the sound that congregation made, the weeping and then, here and there, the startled laughter, the holy noise of a whole community discovering all at once how deeply it had been loved by one quiet man. I will hear that sound until the day I die. That was what Constance had wanted to keep locked behind a fancy door. And Constance was there. She had come, I believe, to make sure I had not embarrassed her. She sat in the front row in her dark, perfect suit, stiff, braced, ready to be ashamed of her father's low beginnings paraded in public. And instead she sat there and she listened to a surgeon and a school teacher and a pastor and a dozen working people in their Sunday best stand up and testify that her father, the man she had been quietly ashamed of, the man she had wanted to repackage into something respectable, had been the most extravagantly generous, the most genuinely great human being any of them had ever known. She listened to a room full of people grieve her father more truly and more deeply than she had ever known how to love him. And I watched, from the side, where I always stand, as the stiffness went out of Constance Gaines's back and her perfect composure broke, and she put her gloved hand over her mouth and she began to cry, not society tears, but the real kind. The kind that comes when you finally understand that you spent years being ashamed of the very thing you should have been on your knees thanking God for. I did not gloat. There is no gloating in my profession, and there was no gloating in my heart, because this was never about beating Constance. It was about Solomon. After the service, she came and found me, and she did not apologize, not in words, because women like Constance do not quite know how to form those words. But she took both my hands in hers, and she held them, and she said in a voice I had not heard from her before, a small voice, a true voice, "I did not know him. I did not know my own father, and you did." And I told her the only thing there was to tell her. I told her, "You know him now." That is what a real funeral is for. And she nodded, and she went back to her family. A different woman than the one who had swept into my office 2 weeks before. And I believe, to this day, that the last gift Solomon Gaines gave away in his long life of quiet giving was the gift of his true self, handed at last to the daughter who had never seen it. I just made sure it got delivered. And those lawyers she had threatened me with? The ones I braced for and that never did come? I have come to believe they never came because, somewhere underneath all that fury, even before she could have told you why, Constance could not quite bring herself to go to war against her own father's dying wish. The shame she carried had a hairline crack in it from the very start. The open doors of that funeral just finished the work of breaking it the rest of the way. So let me leave you with this. Every one of you who knows the difference between the show and the substance. The world is full of people chasing status, polishing the outside, managing the image, ashamed of anything humble, including, sometimes, the humble people who love them most. And the world will let those people look down on you, on your honest work, on your modest building, on your unglamorous and faithful life. Do not let it move you. Do not hand over the truth of who you are or who your people are to make a status chaser comfortable. The plaques and the society pages and the fancy firms downtown, none of that is dignity. Dignity is the quiet thing. It is the bus ticket bought in secret. It is the name written carefully in the book, whether the world was watching or not. It is doing the real work with love when no applause is coming. You hold on to that. You will be the one people weep for honestly in the end. And the status chasers, God help them, will be the ones standing in the front row, finally learning, too late, what mattered all along. I am Augusta Lockhart. A powerful woman tried to make me bury a great man as something small. And I would not do it, because where I come from, we learned the hard way that every soul deserves to be sent home as exactly who they were. I still have my great-grandfather's book. I still write every name in it myself, by hand, the banker and the cleaning woman in the same ink. And when my time comes, I hope somebody buries me the way I buried Solomon Gaines. Honestly, with the doors wide open, as exactly who I was. If you have ever done the quiet and faithful work while others chased the shine, get down in the comments and tell me about it. Tell me about the dignity nobody clapped for. Somebody scrolling tonight is being made to feel small by a person chasing status, and they need to see a whole room of us who know which one of those two things actually lasts. And if this story reached you, you already know how to find the next one. Go on and do your quiet, honest work. The book remembers, and so does God.